In the United States, baseball is seen as a recreational sport to play for sure and occasionally watch as well. But in places like Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Venezuela, playing baseball is a major opportunity to having a professional career. Hello and welcome to this episode of X-Connect Northwest. I'm your host, Greg Mills, and on today's show, we're sitting down with freelance journalist Kim Merlos to discuss baseball and the hardships that foreign players must face on their journey from the minor leagues and hopefully, in their case, to the major leagues. Now, before we get going, a reminder to you at home that you can chime in with your questions. You can connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and right here on our live stream as well. Send your questions in now if you've got them. And just like to welcome Kim with us to the show. Thanks a lot for joining us, Kim.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Well, we're going to start off by listening to a couple of clips from your show that played on NPR, Latino USA, right?
Yeah. I got a chance to pitch to them, and they took it, and then that story came out this summer. So yeah, let's take a listen.
All right, so we're going to hear the first one, and then we'll talk about it a little bit.
Welcome back to Geesa's Stadium here. If you're just joining us on the broadcast, a very unfortunate scene here as we had a collision out in right center field.
Your heart just drops right into your stomach.
Between two Spokane Indians players.
You're imagining two guys running at full speed, no pads on, right? Taking each other out, and they're just lying crumpled over on the field.
Presumably waiting on an ambulance to come here out at the ballpark.
So, Kim, we heard a bit of a broadcast and an explanation of something that happens in baseball. A couple of players collided, but I think more importantly, let's talk about just how important it is for these guys to stay healthy. And tell me a little bit about what that was in the show that we were hearing.
Yeah, so that's basically what we were listening to. We're listening to Chris King, and this was a game that, I remember when the story came out and I saw Chris the following season. I was actually catching him in the parking lot, and he stopped me and he said, man, listening back to those clips that are part of the broadcast, I felt like I was right back in that moment. And what that moment was this wasn't like something that happens all the time in a season. And two guys had kind of just this kind of freak accident collision in the outfield, and it was just like a heart dropper kind of moment, because normally something like that happens and maybe a guy gets up pretty quickly and everybody has this sigh of relief and we move on to the rest of the game. But on that occasion it was 1 minute, and then the next minute passed, and then the next minute passed, and because it's minor league baseball, it's not like, you've got the announcers on TV who are updating you moment by moment about what's going on. It's just kind of, you're all sitting there with this cloud of just what's going on, what's going to happen. We don't have answers. Is everybody okay? And so it was kind of a really kind of heavy, tough moment that fans who were at the game that day experienced, and anybody who was listening that day on the broadcast, they kind of all experienced that together. And I was not present for that game in particular. I was listening from my house and kind of came into the broadcast a little bit late, and it just, even before Chris said anything, you could just kind of tell that something was off. Something had happened,
Now, that was heavy, maybe from an audience standpoint, but in a different way, as you say, from a player's standpoint and from somebody who was watching it or listening to it from your perspective. Now, in our next clip, it's heavy in its own way too, and it's about how these players are existing, coming from different countries, and for the most part, speaking a different language, and how what their day kind of looks like. Let's listen to that as well.
At one point, the thing that struck me as I looked around the room, this really might be the only time that these guys will ever find themselves in a college classroom as students, because every player confronts the truth. It's either baseball or school at some point along the way to their dream.
So this is their opportunity to get together, and I remember listening to this just in the context of hearing it inside the show, but a really interesting little slice of life about the players getting together that day and going to that college classroom and meeting and talking with some other people.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that, right? So in the previous clip, we kind of intro into that by explaining that the guys have come off of this game, super intense game that lasted until 1 a.m., until the league curfew. And they're really, really tired, but they have this commitment that they have to keep, which is to go, number one, to English class the next day, and in particular to this class visit at a local college. And honestly, you know, I'm sure maybe you've been in a position like this. I've been in a position like this where it's just late. You don't want to go, and but you have to go. And so they kind of, you know, had this dilemma the night before, a discussion about, are we going to go? And they show up the next day, most of them, except for one guy. And they have this experience that they're not quite expecting. Like, they're going in kind of thinking, we don't want to be there. Like, I don't want to show up. But by the end, you kind of see a turnaround in kind of their attitude toward the experience, a very different kind of emotion coming out of it than maybe they'd woken up with that morning. And so they got to interact, you know, with other kids really their age, maybe older than them, in an environment that, like, you know, a lot of these kids, they don't get beyond maybe middle school the way that, or high school, because of how baseball and getting into pro baseball, the pipeline for that works in Latin America. You know, for example, some of the guys in the story, there was Carlos Yan. He stopped going to school after the 6th grade. And so now he's in this college classroom with these students, and it was a really cool just moment to see them interacting with people their own age in a space where they might not have another opportunity to do that in if they were back home, or maybe even after their pro careers end. So.
Yeah. Well, let's zoom out a little bit. You're a producer. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got excited about doing this particular project.
Yeah, sure. That story probably starts a few years ago. So now I freelance for NPR, but before that, I rehabbed from a spine injury. It kept me out for a while, a few years actually. And during that time, you know, I didn't really I'd never really been injured before that time, and it really kind of messed me up. Like, I didn't have a mindset or a culture or a language for dealing with it. And I think that what happened was that I, you know, was rehabbing, and then it was also the summer of Yasiel Puig. I know you're a baseball lover, so you might be familiar with this, but basically Yasiel Puig was this Cuban defector who was kind of having this rise in pro baseball. But he was kind of controversial, and at the time I didn't fully understand. I was like, well, the kid just looks like he's having a ton of fun. Why is this such a big deal? And I didn't realize at the time just how much tradition and culture are a part of baseball. And so that kind of got me into it. I had a lot of free time from rehabbing, and then I had kind of this interesting cultural kind of clash that was kind of taking place on a larger stage, and I was like, that's kind of interesting. I want to look into that. And I think that's probably where it started. So I started to kind of I had an opportunity to do like an exhibition piece. I had a mentor who said, hey, you know, WSU is doing an exhibition, why don't you come do a piece? And I was like, well, I'm going to look at Latin American ball players and their experiences, and I'm going to do kind of focus on everyday life for them, and started calling minor league teams and saying, hey, can I talk to your Latin American players? And, you know, there were a few that let me do that. And then that's kind of where the story started coming from, and I started to understand that maybe being a pro baseball player, whether Latin American or not Latin American, maybe isn't so glamorous. Like when you're starting at the bottom, and in particular for the Latin American players, there's a lot of challenges. Like imagine, you're coming from a different country to a different culture, and you don't know the language, but you have to learn the language because the baseball is an environment where English is you're in the United States, you got to talk English. But the really cool thing is that baseball is also really it's multilingual, it's multicultural. So I can go out into a baseball field, a pro baseball field, and I'm gonna hear a mix of Spanish and English and sometimes even other languages. Sure. And so that was probably what got me started there.
Yeah, I would think so. And these kids, young men, oftentimes or sometimes have children. It depends on where they are in their life and in their cycle of minor league baseball. But we're talking about people that are essentially working out a resume to finally make it to, they would hope, the big show where the big dollars are. Are they in constant contact with their families? What are their relationships like with the people back home?
That's a really cool question. Actually, so in that piece, we meet a kid. His name is Helmus Rodriguez. He was the team's ace at the time. And Helmus was only 19 years old. He was from Venezuela. And one of the most surprising things for me, having grown up in the United States, was when I asked him, what's life like here for you? And he started going into telling me about the sacrifices that he had to make to come here. And one of them was that he had a baby daughter back home, and he'd actually missed her birth because, baseball is pro baseball. You come, you're here for 9 months of the year, and then you go home in the off season, you rest for a little bit, and then you come back. So because he wasn't born, he's not living here in the States, his entire family's in Venezuela, he doesn't have the option of being able to go back home and visit family members if somebody dies, or if he has a kid. He can't do that. And actually, in fact, just the other day, for a story that I'm working on this season, I just talked to a kid who just 2 days ago, he just kind of has only been home from the off season, or from the season for about a month, and he did get to see the birth of his child. His child was born just 2 days ago when I talked to him, and he was super, super excited. And so, like, the way that they communicate when they're here is, a lot of social media. They, interestingly enough, they technology-wise, right, they have their phones, but oftentimes, they're paid so little, some of them can't really afford like an actual line. So they might use like an app, a free app. There's a really popular one in particular. It's called WhatsApp. And it allows them to send voice messages and like pictures and just stay in constant communication with their families. Because believe it or not, a lot of these kids, we're looking at, as they can be as young as 18 when at the league that I was covering, up to 24. And for as stoic as they might look, right? Because especially they're like kind of really big for their age. They actually really miss their families. They miss them a lot.
I bet they do. I know we're getting dangerously close to running out of time. There's so much more to talk about. Really quickly, where do we find more information about you and your story?
Yeah, you guys can check out on Instagram at Kim Mizugiri, and that's where I'm gonna keep posting up stuff, and any future stories, that's where I'll have information on that.
That's great. Thank you so much, and I look forward to speaking with you again. Thanks, Kim, and thank you at home for helping us out. You bet. We enjoyed today's show so much. Remember, you can stay connected with us all week. Tweet us, like us on Facebook, add us to your circle on Google+, or email us at kwsutv@wsu.edu. And send us your show ideas. If you missed any part of today's show, we'll have it online at nwptv.org. Thanks for watching. I'm Greg Mills. We'll see you next time and next week on air and online.